Morning, guys. How we doing today? I want to start this off by reiterating a few things. Uh, the black-white choice I made. Uh, I wanted to see some of the differences when I looked from that perspective, and I found a lot. But one of the main reasons why their worlds are so different is the fact they don't play together. And it's why we judge Negro League stats separately from Major League stats. They weren't in the same ballparks. And one of my great contributors, Tony, yesterday asked me who was behind the bands not being integrated. And it's a great question because on some levels, I'm sure guys showed up to a studio with a mixed group and were turned away. I'm sure that happened. I'm sure guys walked in with a mixed group into a label and were told no, thank you. I'm also sure that there was engineers, producers, and labels that were okay with it. But when you really look at the whole issue of why weren't more blacks and whites playing together, especially on records, it's kind of an interesting, intriguing thing. Goodman, of course, crosses the threshold with Wilson and Lionel Hampton back in the 30s. He's playing with that quartet with Krupa, and they track. And Goodman was such a powerful figure that he had the voice and the fist to kind of ensure these men's safety and treatment. And they still were turned away from establishments and restaurants. And from what I remember, Goodman would pick up and go to the next place. He wasn't going to stand for it. And you lost out on some big revenue turning away Benny Goodman's group. But a lot of guys trying to cross over didn't have the axe of Benny Goodman there to oversee him. Norman Granz is another one that wouldn't tolerate for prejudice against the blacks. But it would go both ways to some degrees. White guys who wanted to play with the blacks, they had obstacles to overcome as well. Social norms and the functions of sociology, there was repercussions from that extent, but I don't think that stopped very many. But the financial factors, I'm sure that did. It wasn't that they were going to make more money playing with the black bands. In fact, they were probably going to make 2-3 times more money recording at white studios for white labels with white dollars and cents behind it. So it made financial sense to kind of keep recording with your white buddies at your white labels with your white producers for your white audience. Eminem made a lot more money than a lot of the black rappers who started this thing, you know. And then, so for the black musician to want to cross over to the white band, they're going to hear from other black musicians, why are you playing with the white guys? B, they're going to have to go on tour and deal with white America and being an outsider at all times. At least in a black band with a black following, in a black studio, you're kind of in your own numbers, and there's safety in those numbers to some extent. To being out there by yourself, a lot of blacks refused to tour the South for a long time. So for a white guy to go to record with a black band, he was actually limiting his financial opportunities. And that's not to say guys didn't do it. Of course they did. It just wasn't as simple as we want to integrate this band and record it. And who actually was stopping it? The eye of society was probably the biggest overarching factor. And the ramifications that the players themselves knew were going to have an impact on them and their careers and their families. And being a white DJ today, being hired by blacks a lot, I've seen posts about why you're hiring the white guy, you know? And so that definitely would ring true. If a black DJ feels that way today, a black trombone player is going to wonder why you're hiring Kai Winding, you know? So it wasn't an easy process to say, hey, let's have an integrated group and let's make a record or let's tour. And that's why, for the most part, most of the integration that happens in after-hours jam sessions. And that's where black and white definitely intermingled on a regular basis, and color wasn't really a thing. But in the rest of the everyday life cycle of the jazz musician, race was a huge factor. And it keeps the camps separated in terms of their recording output for a lot longer than the innovations of Goodman, Hampton, and Teddy Wilson. So those impacts are still being felt in the 50s, obviously. And in the 60s, I think it starts to lessen to some degree. But as the audience for jazz dwindles, and the avant-garde had such a small slice of the market, that when they had a mixed group, no one really batted an eye. Who cares what jazz is doing nowadays? You know, jazz was an afterthought by 66. No one really cared what happened in jazz at that point. So it's an interesting thought, and I want to delve more into it. I'm curious to hear some of your thoughts. But to list these guys separately makes sense on a lot of levels. You know, I mean, it's just two different worlds, two different arenas, two different stages. You know, and it's just where it is. And I feel comfortable with it, and I'm proud to talk about what I talk about. And only white people seem to never have an issue with any of my racial content ever. So I'm going to leave it at that. Number 80 in the great Battle of the Saxes. This countdown, I did a lot of my research in groups of 10 to keep it manageable for my mind. If I had done research for all 100, it would have been real foggy going back to number 99 and trying to remember what my little liner notes are talking about, my little cheat notes, you know. So I did it in groups of 10. And I can already tell you that I myself would change some of these guys' positions around, having already gone as far as I've gone. But it is what it is. And like with the white guys, once you got past 20, those next 30 were very interchangeable, and I wouldn't argue if you wanted to change number 48 to number 26. I wouldn't argue. And it's going to be the same here with the black guys. Really, after about 40 or 50, I wouldn't argue with anybody saying, you should move number 85 to number 46. I'd be like, okay. You know? So keep that in mind. The rankings are loose in the second half of these. I only have so many hours in the day to really know all these players. And like I said numerous times, I've learned a lot making this. And so there would be some rearranging, but it is what it is, and we're going to go with it as it is. The first guy I want to talk to you about today is famous for two reasons. The wonderful Sonny Cox. He's a great player. This is on the Cadet Argo label, the sister label of Chess out of Chicago. Sonny is a wonderful, vibrant, full-of-life player who plays the blues, swings hard, has edges of the R&B going on all the time. He's equally, if not more famous, for being an Illinois high school basketball coach and prep school basketball coach who won state championships. He's born in 1938. That's all the detail I got. He's an alto player. He plays around Cincinnati with this band called The Rocks, who backed Jackie Wilson, Laverne Baker, Jerry Butler, R&B groups of that nature, that era. Solomon Burke, I think, is the other one. He moves to Chicago eventually, starts jamming with this guy named, I wrote it down somewhere here. I don't see it. He starts jamming with a couple fellas. They end up forming the Three Souls. Not the Three Sounds, the Three Souls. And these are both on the 4000 series, which runs separate from the 600 series. And there's not a real clear difference to the Argo 4000 versus the 600. 600 is more straightforward jazz, definitely, and the 4000 has a little more R&B edge to it. But in Chicago, jazz and the blues, R&B are all mixed up in the pot on a regular basis. These Three Souls records are really great records. What they look like. The Danger Dan Expressway, that's reference to the Dan Ryan Expressway that cuts through Chicago on the periphery of downtown. Always under construction, always has traffic issues. The Dan Ryan is a mess. So when you hear the Dangerous Dan Express, that's what that's a reference to. I spent a lot of time in Chicago. It's a great city. And then this is the Soul Sounds featuring Sonny Cox, 4044. So they're both kind of that same era, probably 58, 59. And then around the same time, he puts this record out as a leader on the 700 series, part of the 600 series. And I think he has the same guys backing him up here. Well, there's some other guys. Paul Serrano's on this, which is interesting. Whereas Maurice White's on this, who ends up being one of the lead members of Earth, Wind, and Fire. So, great record. I like Sonny Cox a lot. It's this. Barbecue, good times, feeling music, R&B, jazz. And again, he was a basketball coach. And I wrote the school down, where to go. Paul Robeson High School in Chicago. And then 81 he goes to King College Prep School, where he wins 3 state championships, and he's in the Illinois Basketball Hall of Fame. His real name is Sonny Landon Cox. So that's Sonny Cox. That's what I found out about the guy. He's a great player, and you can get any of those 3 records for $10. Great value. Next guy I want to talk about on the Prestige label. A guy with a Houston person. And I'm a big fan of Houston. I got this record as well by him. He's pretty firmly in the soul jazz movement at Prestige of the mid-60s. He's born November 10th in 1934 in Florence, South Carolina. Like I said, he can play some swing and hard bop, but he's really a soul jazz guy. He joins the Air Force at a young age. He ends up in West Germany playing in a group in the Army with Don Ellis, Eddie Harris, Cedar Walton, and Leo Wright. That's some pretty big names for an Army band. On the 60s, he makes some great records on Prestige label. He worked a lot with Etta Jones as well on the Prestige label, who's a great kind of blues jazz singer. He works with Charles Ireland, Ron Carter, Horace Silver, Dakota Staton, Cedar Walton, Rawls, what's his name? The soul singer. I can't think of his first name right now. I just wrote his last name. I say I never forget it. He's got a couple songs I love. See You When I Get There. Love that song. Anyway, he plays with Grant Green, Don Patterson, Sonny Phillips, Johnny Hammond Smith, Groove Holmes. So a lot of that soul era guy is where he's going to be centered a lot of the time. And I enjoy these records. They're fun, they're a party, and he, if what I recall is right, he's still alive at 85 years old. 86 maybe now. So great to have some of these guys still around. Check out his stuff with Don Patterson, the organ player, Sonny Phillips, the organ player, Johnny Hammond Smith, Groove Holmes organ players. That's really where he's kind of at home. This record here, I think it's Don Patterson on this one. Charles Boston, another organ player I kind of forgot about. And on this one, Sonny Phillips, who's a great organ player, comes along in the mid to late 60s at Prestige. Great player, not super famous or well renowned, but he is what you get from Prestige in the 7400 era. Real solid soul jazz sound that you can still barbecue and have a good time to. Number 78 on my list, the great Jimmy Forrest. This is the guy I don't listen to enough, and every time I do, I say I need to listen to more Jimmy Forrest. Born January 24th, 1920. He's a tenor player, born in St. Louis. He had a big hit with the song Night Train, a number 1 R&B song in 1952. He's on the United record label at that point, which is not the same as United Artists, just United Records. He's having some big hits there as well with songs like Hey Mrs. Jones and Bolo Blues. So he's having some pretty good success as an R&B cat. But he has a jazz pedigree. In 48, he joins Duke Ellington's group for a while. He plays with Miles at the Barrel Club in 52. He plays in a small group of Sweets and Al Gray. He has a couple records on Delmark, which I would like to track down till the gin is gone, or gin's almost gone. It's a record I've been trying to find. I'd like to find an old one, but have not been able to. He's got 5 records on Prestige, which I'll show you. This Forest Fire is great on New Jazz. Sit Down and Relax, 72, 33. Most Much is 72, 18. Great record. Out of the Forest is 72, 02. I think that's his first one, which I actually have 2 copies of. So there's a lot of his, I think he has a greatest hits as well that comes out later. So most of his body of work that I have is on the Prestige label. He sticks around for a while and he records on other labels into the 70s, but this is what I have by the fella. Really dig his stuff. He's definitely rooted in the blues, rooted in that soul gospel sound, and he's a great storyteller, like a Dexter Gordon, like a Lester Young. He's going to narrate something to you that's going to resonate. You're going to feel something. The next guy on my list, number 77, is Charles McPherson. And I actually have a couple of his records coming in the mail. The Con Alma record, and the one right before this is also on the way. I was hoping they'd be here by the time I made this episode. It wasn't to be. Sometimes sellers don't ship as fast as you hope. But McPherson's a great player. I've enjoyed this record for a long time with Barry Harris, Lonnie Hillier, Ray McKinney, and Billy Higgins. Number 7480. So it probably puts it about 65, 66, 67. He's born July 24th, 1939 in Joplin, Missouri, which is kind of along the eastern, I think it's on the eastern border of Missouri. I got a thing now. It's on the river anyway, I know that. So that's probably the eastern border. He's an alto player. He was raised in Detroit, and that's kind of where he comes up. He plays with Mingus off and on from 1960 to 1974. So that's where a lot of people are going to know him from. He's in the Bird film, the film called Bird, about Charlie Parker. And he's actually one of the guys recording some of the parts for that film, imitating Parker. So he's got some roots in bebop, but he's definitely kind of that Prestige soul jazz guy. And like I said, I have the Con Alma record coming, which I really like. I had it on CD for a long time, and I'm looking forward to getting that on vinyl again. Not here yet, sadly. I'd hoped it would have been. This guy is another guy that's on my list by default. And his name is Nicky Hill. And he's a great Chicago tenor player that you really only hear rumor of and whispers about. He doesn't get any records as a leader that I know of. My friend Scott Baldwin is from that area and is as close to an expert on Chicago jazz as it gets. Doesn't think he has any records as a leader anywhere. But there's very little on Wikipedia or anywhere about him. But Nicky Hill, right there, is a really great player that has a lot of blues and guts and Lester Young storytelling and smooth. See that smooth creaminess? This is the MJT3 record, MJT plus 3 Walter Perkins group with Paul Serrano, Richard Abrams, Bob Cranshaw. Great Chicago modern jazz, hard bop, driving blue note style jazz. And Nicky Hill is great on this session. He's also great on this Ira Sullivan session on the Delmark label, another great little Chicago label. Bob's Jazz and Blues Mart in Chicago. Bob Cochner, is it? He was the founder of Delmark. That guy knows everything about jazz in the 60s, especially in 70s. But yeah, there's some great titles on Delmark. I don't have enough of them. A lot of them are fairly under the radar names. But like I said, the Jimmy Forrest stuff. And a lot of the stuff on Delmark is blues stuff. But there is some great jazz titles. And then this Ira Sullivan record on VJ also has Nicky Hill. And you get little tastes of this great player that you don't really get to hear much from. Which in some ways makes him fairly intriguing, you know? And like I said in yesterday's episode, of all these 150, 200 guys that we're going to talk about, between the white and the black guys, there's got to be 90% more whose names will never be spoken again. Guys just who are in the minor leagues, playing in bars, clubs, lounges, local bands, church groups, you know. There was guys who played saxophone in black churches that could play the bebop, but never did because of how they felt about the secular nature of the music, you know. So there's untold guys who were great that never made the big leagues, the big stages of jazz, recording with the big bands, getting their own dates. The smallest percentage got their own dates. And we're talking 200 sax players here roughly, you know. And sax players, especially in the 60s, it was easier for them to get a session than anybody, except for maybe a piano player. And piano players always have the easiest time getting sessions. They can work in any format, any size group. But moving on, we're talking number 75 now. A guy who I dig a lot, Sahib Shihab. This is his record on Argo, number 742. That's a tough record to find and can fetch a pretty good penny when it does show up. He's born Edmund Gregory, plays with Roy Eldridge at a young age, flute, baritone, alto, and soprano. He's born July 23rd, 1925 in Savannah, Georgia, in the heart of the Deep South. He converts fairly early on in the 40s to Islam, changes his name to Sahib Shihab, which is a fun name to say. He has a couple of records at Savoy, which I don't have sadly. One split with Herbie Mann, and I've lost it at auction numerous times. The summer we had last year, whatever that's called. And I want to get that cool cover and all. And the other one's that yellow cover with the kind of square with the red. Awful cover. Savoy does some of the worst covers ever. Another record that kind of is right in the wheelhouse for Savoy collectibles. Savoy stuff from 59, 60, 61. A lot of it's kind of pretty expensive and tougher to come by. And I haven't got that one yet either. But Shihab's a great player. He does play baritone at times, but he sticks to tenor most of the time. He's part of the hard bop scene. He played with guys like Monk, Joe Henderson, Tad Dameron, Kenny Dorham, Dizzy Gillespie, Benny Golson, Art Blakey. In 59, he tours Europe with Quincy Jones, and he decides to stay in Europe. And he's, I think, in Denmark and Germany, and he ends up staying in Paris for a while. He's very disillusioned with the state of social economics and politics in America. He can't stand to go back. He does come back for a few tours here and there, but it's a land he wants very little to do with anymore. In 61, he joins Kenny Clark and Francie Boland's great group in Europe, and he's a part of that group for 12 years. And the Francie Boland Kenny Clark group is a great European group with Kenny Clark, of course, the great American. Shihab's in the group for all those years. A lot of it's European guys. Great records if you get the chance to get them. There's one on Blue Note, a couple on Atlantic, but most of it's European release. He ends up in Copenhagen, and he ends up working at Polytechnic University or school, and then he ends up doing scores for television, cinema, and the theater. And I mention that because in the 50 white guys, how many of those guys ended up in show business? Right here in America. For a black guy to get that outcome, he had to go to Copenhagen. Why are we doing black and white separate? Because the shit's different. Why are we separating the races? Because the races were separate. Their experiences were different. What they had to deal with was different. So what's coming through their horns every time they play is different. And you can't compare them. And just mere ability on the horn is not enough to say you are equal. What you have to say emotionally, what's coming through your horn, the suffering you experienced, that's what separates the ones who get remembered. And they're not remembered because they're black. They're remembered because their suffering had so much integrity and so much sincerity that it connects with people. They just all happen to be black because they suffered the most. But it's not the black that makes them that situation. It's their environment that they live in. Because they're black, they have to suffer. And so they make music that's expressing a greater condition of sorrow than white guys can muster. And white guys often use this music as a passing through. As a young guy, I wanted to play that black music. It was great. But now I'm playing in a Vegas lounge with whoever, Tony Bennett. I'm working in the Columbia Studios, Capitol Studios. I'm working for MGM. I'm in the studio orchestra. Like, jazz for those guys wasn't a necessity or a lifestyle. For black guys, it was it. And so for a black guy to get into show business, he was in Denmark. So he's the first guy I've come across in this so far that ended up in show business like so many of the white cats did. And it just keeps making itself pretty clear. Speaking of show business, this guy actually did make it into the Hollywood scenes and had a lot of success crossing over. Buddy Collette, number 74. Buddy is, of course, renowned for his years with Chico Hamilton, and he was a founding member of the Chico Hamilton group with Chico, obviously, and all that great chamber, cool jazz that they make is all fantastic. He gets a couple records here as a leader on contemporary. He has a few more out there that I want to get eventually, one on ABC. There's another early one on the Dig label, which I have an offer on, a beat up one right now. I'm hoping I get it, just because the cover's great. But Buddy Collette's an interesting story. Born August 6th of 1921 in LA in the Watts neighborhood. And Watts in that era was the ultimate melting pot on the West Coast. Just every group was integrated. You're going to school with languages and cultures, and a lot of it was poor, but Watts was a better off neighborhood then than it was in the 80s and 90s during the Bloods and Crips and all that stuff going on. Watts was a far better off place at that time. He plays the flute, the sax, the clarinet. He's a great composer. He actually competes against Chico early on in the talent show, loses to Chico's group, and then Chico asks him to join his group. He's later actually teaching guys like Mingus, and Mingus actually joins their group for a while. He's a studio guy. He's playing with Frank Sinatra, Ella Fitzgerald, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, Nat King Cole, Nelson Riddle. And so let me put those names to you back in the one word form. He plays with Frank, Ella, Duke, Count, Nat, and Riddle. That's some creme de la creme in terms of recording gigs for a white guy or a black guy. But he's in LA, and the climate is different there, not just geographically. You know, racially, the things are somewhat different. He taught Charles Lloyd. He teaches Frank Morgan. He teaches Mingus some stuff as a young player. He's the first black guy to be hired by a nationally broadcast TV orchestra. First guy, West Coast, but he integrated and he made it in. And he ends up joining Groucho Marx on the You Bet Your Life show and does a lot of arranging and composing for that stuff. He actually ends up having quite a long career, and he's quite successful, and he's a great talented player. And you really need to check out the Chico Hamilton sides on Pacific to get a good grasp of who Buddy Collette is. These records are also fantastic. If I get that one on the Dig label, I'll definitely show it to you when I get it. So Buddy's a great player, and he's going to be playing with mostly West Coast cats on these records. He's playing clarinet, alto, flute, and tenor on this one. She looks like Shirley Mann's on this. Vinegar's on this. Calvin Jackson's on some of it. Great stuff. It leads us to number 73, Hal Singer. Number 7153 on the Prestige label. This is actually the Swingville version, and Prestige would often issue Swingville records onto a Prestige number label, or sometimes they would take 7,000 series records and reissue them as Swingsville or Moodsville records because they fit that format, and they were going to reissue it anyway. So let's give it a new title, and we'll put it over there, and maybe someone will think it's a new Hal Singer record. You know, I think Weinstock was a tricky dick, no question about it. Hal Singer was born October 8th, 1919. He's still alive. He's 100 years old. 101 by now. He's the last survivor of the Tulsa riots of 1921. He was 2 years old at the time, lived in Tulsa, born and raised there, and of course he probably doesn't remember too much firsthand, but he certainly was brought up with the nightmare stories of one of the ugliest chapters in American history, and it's a history that white America wasn't told. That was swept under the carpet, but you better believe the black community knew about that and didn't forget. You better believe those stories were passed along, you know, in the black community. And I do a great episode on the Tulsa race riots. Coleman Hawkins episode. It's kind of a dual episode there, about 40 episodes ago last month, and it's worthwhile watching that episode. I did some good research on the Tulsa situation and the legacy of that, how it lived with the terror of it, and the black musicians like Coleman Hawkins, like Hal Singer. The blues comes from these events. You know, it's these things that stir up what their guts are telling us. He plays with Jay McShann in 43, Hot Lips Page in 47 after he goes to New York City. He's playing with Orrin Hot Lips Page. He becomes a King label session guy, so he's recording sax on a lot of King records, which are going to be kind of R&B flavored stuff. King's out of Cincinnati, and Cincinnati's always been kind of an R&B center. It was a big home of the funk soul movement. A lot of great funk bands come from Dayton, which is right outside of Cincinnati. And there's not a lot of great jazz names that come from Cincinnati, oddly enough. But in 48, he has a pretty big hit with a song called Cornbread on the Savoy label, and that becomes his nickname, Hal Cornbread Singer. You could have a worse nickname for sure. In 58, he joins Prestige. He makes this record for the Swingsville, and it's also issued on 7,000 series, like 71, 90 or something like that. He joins the Metropole Cafe and starts playing with guys like Hawkins and Eldridge. And at 65, he joins Earl Hines. They end up going to Europe for a while. He decides to stay in Paris. Enough. Ellington comes to Europe. He joins Ellington to tour Europe and Africa. And then in 74, he does a State Department tour of Africa with Horace Parlan. So he's with a lot of the greats for a long time and makes a pretty big impact. He had the big hit Cornbread in 48 on Savoy. Hal Cornbread Singer, a player worth looking for, and again, not one that gets too much credibility. Another player that I've been learning some about, so like some of these guys I didn't know too much about at all going into this, was a guy by the name of Leo Wright. And Leo's a great player. He has 2 records on Atlantic, number 1358 and 1393, which puts them 1962, 63. Yeah, I'd say in that era somewhere. Leo Wright is born December 14, 1933 in Wichita Falls, Texas. He's an alto, flute, clarinet player, and he definitely has some of the Texas tenor sound, even though he's an alto player. He gets that pretty big bluesy feel sound. He plays with Mingus, Kenny Burrell, Johnny Coles on his Blue Note record, Blue Mitchell on Step Lightly on Blue Note. Dizzy Gillespie. He plays on the Tad Dameron Riverside recording. He's really on a lot of great records. He plays with Jack McDuff on the Screamin' album. Dave Pike on one of his New Jazz sessions. Lalo Schifrin on some of his Verve and other label stuff. And then he's the great player of the flute on the great Antonio Carlos Jobim, composer of Desafinado record, that I've listened to 1,000 times. I've said it's one of the great records out there for lounging, for playing at events. I've recommended ever since I started doing this channel, that fantastic record. And never once did I realize it was Leo Wright that was playing the flute all throughout that record. And it's one of my favorite records of all time. So Leo Wright, another guy that you don't hear too much about, but he certainly played with a pretty high pedigree player. And the guy's got some blues and guts to him. That leads me to number 71 on the list. Counting our way down. And this guy is one of the real giants of the bebop era. He also goes to Europe and was there such a long time that he was forgotten in America for a large part. He's in Europe for 26 years. And so he's largely a forgotten entity here in America by that time when he comes back. But this is Don Byas tenor saxophone and orchestra on the Savoy label, number 12203, which makes it the reissue of a 10-inch and maybe 2 10-inches even. I have one of the 10 inches coming in the mail again. It's not here yet. It'll be here sometime next week. I'll show it to you when I get it. I'm kind of excited about that. Old Savoy 10 inches are always fun to have. Born October 21st in 1912. Don Byas, tenor player from Muskogee, Oklahoma. A large integral part of the bebop movement. He starts out playing with Basie, Duke, Dizzy, and then Blakey, which is a high level of talent right there. He plays with his idol. He idolized Benny Carter at a young age and ends up playing with Benny Carter later in his life. In 33, he moves to LA, plays with Lionel Hampton, and Lionel Hampton seems to be one of the guys with the black musicians who takes a lot of these young kids under his wing. He seems his name keeps popping up over and over and over again of a guy who took the fame he was given by Benny Goodman and is using it for good the best way he knows how, by bringing as many young black musicians into the fold as he can, into his groups, to help these guys propel their careers and get off on their own foot. And so I didn't really realize how much of a factor Lionel Hampton was and how many guys went through Hampton's ranks. But he's a bit like Dizzy Gillespie. It seems like most guys spend a few months playing with Lionel Hampton. And Hampton's a genius, without any question. One of the greatest virtuosos ever to play any music. He moves to New York City in 37. He starts playing behind Ethel Waters at the Cotton Club. He's playing with Lucky Millinder, Andy Kirk, again, Benny Carter. In the 40s, he records with Billie Holiday some. He's done a couple of great tracks with her. 41, he's playing at After Hours at Mittens with guys like Monk, Charlie Christian, Kenny Clark, Oscar Pettiford, Max Roach, Wallington, Parker, Gillespie, Hawkins. 41 to 44, he's playing with all those guys. He's cites Art Tatum as his style of where he gets his playing from, his virtuosity, his bebopism. And I've said before, Tatum is a precursor to Parker. Tatum is including all those same notes in the arpeggios that Parker innovates with, but Tatum doesn't get any of the credit at all, which is a little strange to me. But Tatum is a incredible virtuoso that did these things that seem inhuman at times on the piano. He records at Savoy 46, which is what this is part of. He ends up in Paris, where he stays for 26 years. And he records some over there, and he's a pretty big star over there, but he becomes pretty much forgotten here in Europe, which is just a sad story, but it's a story as it's told. You know, Dexter Gordon had a fairly celebrated return. Don Byas, not quite so much, but he's certainly deserving of a great deal of recognition. His recorded output in America is quite minimal, and I'm sure there's a lot of stuff that got recorded in France on European labels, and I just don't have access to that stuff here. I didn't really know about much of it, and I never really tried to collect it when I did see it, because I was still trying to collect the great American labels to know that history. And so next for me is learning the European side of the story. There's certainly a different sound to Americans playing in Europe. They sound a little more comfortable, a little less edgy, a little more at ease. And thank God for that experience for them in Europe, where they could actually relax and kick back and take a deep breath. For the Lucky Thompsons, the Dexter Gordons, we've already had a number of guys on this list go there and stay for extended periods of time. So that's our first 30, and there's already some pretty big names on this list. And so we can see from 100 to 70, there's some names that are equal to the White Cats that are in the 10s and 20s. So the black talent pool runs deep. And a lot of these guys, like I said, were pretty obscure to white audiences in the 50s and 60s. But history has remembered them so well because of the gut, because of the honest, painful experience that the black male expresses when they play that horn. And remember, jazz isn't like other music where you're expressing the same thing through a song because the lyrics are rigid. And this is about I Love Sally. And tomorrow I'm going to play, it's going to be about I Love Sally. Jazz allows me to improvise and emote from my well of emotions on a daily basis, my personal interaction with the world today and how I feel about it. That's special. That's special. So that's why a guy like Don Byas, Coleman Hawkins, Ben Webster, Lucky Thompson, Dexter Gordon, Lester Young, Lockjaw Davis, Don Byas, Sonny Rollins, Hank Mobley. There's the center of the saxophone. And this episode was initially going to start as just that. Getting from Hawkins to Coltrane or Rollins, talking about that lineage of, Dexter Gordon, Lucky Thompson, Ben Webster. How do we get to Lester Young? How do we get from Hawkins to Coltrane? And it just kind of sprawled, and it got divided the way it did. I put the white guys first. We talked about them and their experiences, learned a lot. Now we're talking about the black guys and their experiences, still learning a lot. And it's fun learning with you guys. And I have the records, which are part the teacher. A lot of what teaches is the collection itself. Sometimes you have it and you slowly soak it in. And doing the stuff I'm doing right now, there's a lot of soaking going on. And I kind of looked around the room the other day, and I want to show you just the records that are everywhere. Up there, records. And what that looks like is how my soul funk hip hop room looked like when I was DJing a lot. There was a lot of records everywhere, but I was making a living off those records. And they were being used and finding a home and a purpose for their being at such a high level. I was like, it's okay that they're everywhere because I'm using them every day. And so now my jazz, I realized yesterday, my jazz has become that, where I'm utilizing this collection like a tool chest. I'm digging these tools out. And some days I gotta carve, some days I gotta drill, some days I gotta dig, But we're going through the records and really getting to know all this work. This sacred art form. Jazz records everywhere. It's a mess. But that's how you know you're using them. And I would rather this be the case than them all just sitting on a shelf waiting for the day I decide to play this record again. You know, it's fun playing with them every day and really getting to know, and you get attached to them when you interact with them like this. You get to understand and comprehend things when you see these big cross sections by year, by label, by artist. There's all these different ways you can take in this information, and it all creates this kind of grid of knowledge that everything cross-references at a point. And so having these records out and playing with them as much as I am, it's kind of an epiphany last night. Like, oh shit, I'm doing with my jazz records what I did with my funk and hip hop for years. I'm using them all the time, a lot. And that's where I wanted to be. And I'd rather be doing that with the music I love to listen to now than the music I liked to listen to 25 years ago. Playing Dr. Dre and Snoop is fun, but that's where I was in the 90s, early thousands. And to play it still now, it's a little bit redundant for me. And I'll do it if the party demands it and it's the right thing and it makes people go, woo, it's fun. But if I'm just playing for a half full room, some bar hired me, and I gotta play Nelly, it's like, it's work. So it's great to know that my collection is kind of being utilized as efficiently as it is right now. And you guys are all making that possible. So thanks very much. Check out my Patreon page. Stay tuned for 70 to 61 coming tomorrow. So y'all be safe. Peace.